For more than 3,000 years, one of ancient Egypt's most powerful women has been missing. Nefertiti stood beside Pharaoh Akhenaten during one of the most radical transformations in Egyptian history. Then she disappeared. Her tomb has never been conclusively identified. Her body has never been securely found. But now, a forgotten city and a series of extraordinary ancient tombs are giving archaeologists new clues about the royal family that changed Egypt forever. And what they discovered inside these ancient burials may completely change the way we understand their world. What if one of ancient Egypt's greatest secrets was never truly lost? What if, beneath the ruins of a forgotten city, archaeologists were standing on the edge of a story that could finally explain what happened to one of Egypt's most mysterious royal families? For more than 3,000 years, the names of Nefertiti and Tutankhamun have survived through gold, stone, paintings, and fragments of ancient records. But their lives remain strangely incomplete. Nefertiti appears suddenly in history, rises beside one of Egypt's most controversial pharaohs, and then seems to vanish. Tutankhamun becomes king while still a child, inherits a kingdom shaken by religious upheaval, and dies before reaching adulthood. Between these two figures lies a missing chapter of Egyptian history. And recently, archaeologists uncovered a city that may bring us closer to that forgotten story. The desert surrounding Luxor looks almost lifeless today. Endless sand stretches toward distant mountains, broken only by temples, tombs, and fragments of walls left behind by a civilization that once ruled one of the greatest kingdoms on Earth. But beneath this silent landscape, the ground still remembers. In 2021, archaeologists announced the discovery of an enormous ancient settlement near Luxor. The site quickly became known as the Lost Golden City, or the City of Aten. It was buried beneath the desert for more than 3,000 years. At first glance, this might sound like another archaeological discovery among thousands made in Egypt. But this city was different. It was remarkably well preserved. Mud brick walls still outlined houses, workshops, streets, storage areas, and administrative buildings. Archaeologists found objects that appeared to have been left behind almost as if the inhabitants had simply walked away one afternoon and never returned. There were tools used in daily life: pottery, jewelry, food remains, decorative objects, seals, even evidence of industrial activity. And slowly a picture began to emerge. This was not simply a collection of ruins. It was a living city. People had cooked here, worked here, manufactured objects here, worshipped here. They had walked through these streets thousands of times, never imagining that one day their homes would become archaeological evidence for people who had not yet been born. But the most fascinating question was not what they found. It was when this city existed. The settlement dates to the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, a ruler who controlled Egypt during one of the wealthiest and most powerful periods of its history. His reign lasted for decades, and during this time Egypt experienced enormous construction projects, international trade, artistic development, and extraordinary wealth. But Amenhotep III was also the father of a man who would completely transform Egyptian religion. His son was Amenhotep IV. History would remember him by another name, Akhenaten. And beside Akhenaten stood one of the most famous women of the ancient world, Nefertiti. The discovery of the city suddenly placed archaeologists much closer to the world in which this extraordinary royal family actually lived. Imagine walking through these streets more than 3,000 years ago. The sun would have been brutal during the day. Workers would have moved between buildings carrying tools and materials. Smoke would have risen from ovens. Craftsmen would have shaped objects by hand. Officials would have recorded supplies, would have carried food and water. Somewhere in this enormous settlement, decisions connected to the royal court may have influenced the lives of thousands of people. And somewhere beyond these ordinary streets stood the machinery of an empire. Egypt was not simply a kingdom. It was a civilization built around the idea that the pharaoh stood between humanity and the gods. But that ancient order was about to change. Akhenaten abandoned many traditional Egyptian gods and elevated the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, to an extraordinary position. He moved the royal court away from traditional centers and established a new capital at a place called Akhetaten. Today, the ruins of that city are known as Amarna. And this is where the story becomes even stranger. Because Nefertiti was not merely the wife standing beside the king. She was portrayed in a remarkably powerful position. She appears in royal art performing religious rituals with Akhenaten. She was shown alongside him in scenes that emphasized their connection to the Aten. In some representations, she appears almost as powerful and prominent as the king himself. Then, suddenly, the historical record becomes uncertain. Nefertiti disappears. There is no clear ancient record explaining exactly what happened to her. Did she die? Did she change her name? Did she continue ruling under another identity? Could she have survived long enough to influence the young Tutankhamun? For centuries, these questions have fascinated Egyptologists. And then there is Tutankhamun. The boy king is famous today because his tomb was discovered in 1922 with an extraordinary collection of treasures. But the golden mask and magnificent artifacts can sometimes distract us from the real historical mystery. Tutankhamun was not simply a wealthy young king. He was born into one of the most turbulent royal families in Egyptian history. He inherited a kingdom still dealing with the consequences of Akhenaten's religious revolution. The old gods had been suppressed. Temples had been neglected. Traditional religious institutions had been disrupted. When Tutankhamun became pharaoh, Egypt began moving back toward its ancient religious traditions. His name itself changed. He was originally associated with the Aten, but later became Tutankhamun, honoring the traditional god Amun. The transformation was more than a change of name. It represented the restoration of an older Egypt. And the lost Golden City may provide a rare glimpse into the world surrounding this dramatic transition. Archaeologists believe the settlement was connected to the reign of Amenhotep III and remained active into the period associated with his successors. That means these streets may have existed during the lifetime of the people who shaped the story of Nefertiti and Tutankhamun. Think about what that means. The walls beneath the sand may have been standing while royal ceremonies were taking place hundreds of miles away. The workers who lived here may have served institutions connected to the palace. The objects buried beneath the desert may have belonged to people who witnessed the transformation of Egypt from the world of Amenhotep III to the revolutionary reign of Akhenaten and eventually the restoration under Tutankhamun. Yet the city itself does not provide an easy answer. It does something more interesting. It gives us context. For centuries, historians have tried to reconstruct ancient Egypt from monumental temples and royal tombs. But palaces and monuments often show us what rulers wanted the world to remember. Ordinary settlements tell a different story. They reveal how people actually lived. And sometimes, that ordinary evidence can become more powerful than a golden mask. A workshop can tell us what people manufactured. A discarded tool can reveal what they were doing. A sealed room can reveal how supplies were organized. A simple piece of pottery can reveal how far goods traveled. And a small inscription can sometimes connect an entire settlement to a royal administration. The lost Golden City is therefore more than a spectacular archaeological site. It is a missing piece of the puzzle. But there is still a much bigger mystery. If this city was active during the period surrounding Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Tutankhamun, why was it abandoned? Why did people leave? And where did they go? The answer could be connected to one of the greatest transformations ancient Egypt ever experienced. A king changed the gods. A queen vanished from history. A new capital rose in the desert. And a child inherited the throne of a kingdom struggling to recover from years of religious upheaval. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, this remarkable city disappeared beneath the sand. For more than 3,000 years, Nobody walked its streets. Nobody heard its workers. Nobody knew exactly what had happened there, until archaeologists began digging. And with every layer of earth they removed, the ancient silence started to break. Because perhaps the lost Golden City does not contain the tomb of Nefertiti. Perhaps it does not contain the secret burial chamber of Tutankhamun. Maybe there is no single object waiting underground to solve everything. Instead, the real secret may be hidden in thousands of smaller clues. A forgotten workshop, a royal seal, a piece of jewelry, a wall, a tool, a footprint preserved by time. Together, they may allow us to reconstruct the final years of a royal family whose story has remained incomplete for more than 3 millennia. And somewhere between the golden city of Aten, the vanished queen Nefertiti, and the young pharaoh Tutankhamun lies a question that still refuses to die. What really happened to Egypt's most mysterious royal family? The deeper archaeologists go, the more complicated the answer becomes. And this is only the beginning. The deeper we look into the world of Nefertiti and Tutankhamun, the more the familiar story begins to fall apart. For generations, we imagined ancient Egypt as a civilization frozen in time, ruled by powerful pharaohs whose lives were carved permanently into stone. But the reality was far more chaotic. Kings disappeared. Names were erased. Cities were abandoned. Religious beliefs were overturned. And sometimes entire chapters of history were deliberately removed from the record. This is exactly what makes the story of Nefertiti so unsettling. She did not simply disappear from history. Her memory appears to have been attacked. To understand what may have happened to her, we have to travel back to a period when Egypt was experiencing one of its most extraordinary transformations. The man responsible was Akhenaten. Before becoming Akhenaten, he was known as Amenhotep IV, the son of the powerful pharaoh Amenhotep III. He inherited an empire at the height of its wealth. Egypt controlled territory, collected tribute, traded with distant kingdoms, and built monuments on a scale that few civilizations could match. Then something changed. Akhenaten began elevating the Aten, the radiant disk of the sun, above the traditional gods of Egypt. At first, the change may have appeared gradual, but eventually, it became revolutionary. The old religious system was pushed aside. The name of Amun, one of Egypt's most important gods, was attacked in inscriptions. Traditional temples lost influence. Images of old deities were damaged or erased, and the king moved his royal court to a completely new city. He called it Akhetaten. Today, we know the site as Amarna. It was built in a place that had not previously served as a major royal capital. There were no ancient traditions tying the location to the old gods. Akhenaten could start again, and he did. The city stretched across the desert beside the Nile. Palaces, temples, administrative buildings, homes, workshops, and royal residences appeared with astonishing speed. It was almost as if an entire government had been transplanted into the wilderness. At the center of this new world stood Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Their images are unlike almost anything else in Egyptian art. Akhenaten was often portrayed with an unusual elongated face, narrow eyes, a long jaw, and a strangely shaped body. Nefertiti, by contrast, was frequently shown with an elegant face and a tall, distinctive crown. But the most important detail is how often she appears beside him. Nefertiti was not hidden behind the king. She was visible. She participated in religious ceremonies. She appeared in official scenes. In some reliefs, she is shown making offerings to the Aten. In others, she stands beside Akhenaten in positions of extraordinary prominence. There are even scenes where Nefertiti is portrayed striking enemies, an image traditionally associated with kings. This raises a fascinating possibility. Was she simply the king's wife? Or was she an active political partner in the religious revolution? We cannot know exactly how much power she possessed. Ancient Egyptian art was designed to communicate ideas, not necessarily provide a literal photograph of reality. But one thing is clear: Nefertiti mattered. Then, around the later years of Akhenaten's reign, something strange happened. Her appearances became less frequent, and eventually, she vanished. No definitive tomb has been identified for her. No universally accepted burial has been discovered. No ancient document clearly explains her final years. For an Egyptian queen of such importance, this is extraordinary. The disappearance becomes even more mysterious because Akhenaten's final years are themselves complicated by uncertainty. Several royal figures appear in the historical record during this period. One of them is a mysterious individual known as Neferuaten. Some scholars believe this may have been another name or title used by Nefertiti. Others disagree, and another name appears in the records: Smenkhkare. Was this another individual? Was it a co-ruler? Was the identity connected to Nefertiti? Or was this simply a completely separate person whose brief reign has been misunderstood? The evidence is frustratingly incomplete. Ancient Egyptian history often feels like a giant stone puzzle where someone has deliberately removed half the pieces. And then comes the boy who would inherit this broken kingdom: Tutankhamun. He was probably born during the Amarna period, surrounded by the religious experiment created by his father. His exact maternal identity has been debated for years, although genetic studies have provided important clues about his family. His childhood would have been unlike that of almost any other pharaoh. Imagine being raised in a royal court where the traditional gods had been rejected. Imagine growing up in a city built almost from nothing. Imagine watching your father's religious revolution transform Egypt while powerful priests and officials lost influence. And then imagine becoming king while still a child. That was Tutankhamun's world. When he took the throne, the religious revolution began to collapse. The old gods returned. The temples reopened. The name of Amun regained its power. And the royal court eventually moved away from Akhenaten's city. Tutankhamun's name itself became part of this restoration. The Aten connection was abandoned, and the young king became Tutankhamun, meaning roughly the living image of Amun. This was not just personal branding. It was political repair. Egypt was trying to reverse years of disruption. But the most fascinating question is what happened to the people who had built and inhabited Akhenaten's new world. The lost Golden City may help answer that question. Because while the monumental city of Akhenaten was being created farther north, the settlement near Luxor reveals another side of the royal system. It shows a civilization functioning behind the monuments. Workers produced goods. Administrators organized supplies. People cooked, lived, worshipped, and raised families. The archaeological evidence suggests that this was a highly organized community. And that matters because the story of pharaohs is often told as if kings alone created history. They did not. Thousands of ordinary people built the world in which those kings could rule. They made the bricks. They shaped the tools. They prepared the food. They transported stone. They created the jewelry. They maintained the temples. And when the royal court changed direction, these people had to change with it. That makes the abandoned city especially fascinating. Its sudden disappearance may represent a much larger political transformation. The city seems to have been abandoned after a period of activity rather than slowly disappearing through centuries of decline. Why? Was the population ordered to leave? Did the government move? Did the religious transformation make the settlement unnecessary? Or did the changing royal administration simply abandon an older center as Egypt entered a new era? There is another possibility that makes the story even more intriguing. Perhaps the city was connected to the massive construction and religious projects of the royal court. If so, its workers may have been part of the machinery that supported the rulers whose names dominate Egyptian history. And that means every workshop and storage room becomes a tiny window into the lives of people who may have witnessed the rise and fall of the Amarna period. But there is something else beneath this story, something that archaeologists still cannot fully explain. Why did later Egyptians seem so determined to erase Akhenaten? After his death, his religious reforms were rejected. His monuments were dismantled. His name was removed from official king lists. The city of Akhetaten was abandoned. The temples dedicated to the Aten fell into ruin. Later rulers portrayed the Amarna period almost like a mistake that needed to be forgotten. And if Nefertiti had been deeply involved in that revolution, her memory could have suffered as well. This may explain why finding her final resting place has been so difficult. If her tomb was deliberately hidden, destroyed, reused, or erased, archaeology may never recover a simple answer. Yet there are clues. Fragments of statues, broken reliefs, royal inscriptions, burial objects, and the strange succession of rulers after Akhenaten. Each piece offers another possibility. One theory suggests Nefertiti may have survived Akhenaten and possibly ruled during the transition that followed his death. Another suggests she died before him. Others propose that the woman who later disappeared from the records may have continued under another royal identity. None of these theories has been proven conclusively. And that uncertainty is exactly what keeps the mystery alive. Because if Nefertiti did survive into the period immediately preceding Tutankhamun's reign, she could have played a crucial role in the transition from Akhenaten's religious experiment back to traditional Egyptian belief. Imagine that. A woman who helped establish one of the most radical religious systems in Egyptian history could potentially have lived long enough to witness its collapse, and perhaps even helped guide the child king who came afterward. We do not know. But the archaeological landscape is beginning to give us something we have never had before. Context. The lost Golden City is not a magical answer buried beneath the sand. It is something more valuable. It is evidence of how the Egyptian world actually functioned during the period surrounding these extraordinary rulers. And the more evidence we uncover, the more clearly we see that the Amarna Revolution was not simply a story about one king changing the gods. It was a story about an entire society being forced to adapt. A city rose. A religion changed. A queen disappeared. A young boy inherited the throne. And then Egypt attempted to erase the entire experiment from memory. But history has a strange habit. The things people try hardest to destroy are sometimes the things that survive the longest. The walls of Akhenaten's city were broken. His name was attacked. His temples were dismantled. His religion disappeared. Yet thousands of years later, archaeologists are still finding his world beneath the desert. And perhaps somewhere beneath those same sands lies another piece of the puzzle. Perhaps it is a forgotten inscription. Perhaps a sealed chamber. Perhaps a royal object whose meaning has not yet been understood. Or perhaps, one day, archaeologists will uncover the burial place of the woman whose face has survived for more than 3,000 years. Nefertiti, the queen who appeared beside a revolutionary king. The mother, stepmother, or royal ancestor connected to a boy pharaoh. The woman whose final chapter remains missing. For now, her tomb remains silent. But the city is speaking. And its message may lead us directly toward the darkest and most mysterious years of the Amarna royal family. For more than 3,000 years, the sands of Egypt have hidden a question that refuses to die. If Nefertiti disappeared from history, where did she go? And if the young Tutankhamun inherited the throne only a short time after the collapse of Akhenaten's revolution, what happened inside the royal family during those missing years? Somewhere between the abandoned city of Akhetaten, the forgotten streets of the lost Golden City, and the tombs of the Valley of the Kings lies a story that was never completely recorded. But archaeology has a strange way of bringing the dead back into the conversation. A fragment of stone can speak. A damaged inscription can whisper. Even a sealed tomb can preserve a secret for thousands of years. And sometimes, the most important clue is not what archaeologists find, but what is strangely missing. When Akhenaten died, Egypt entered a dangerous period of uncertainty. The king who had challenged centuries of religious tradition was gone. His extraordinary city was still standing, but the political system that created it was beginning to collapse. The Aten had lost its privileged position. The old gods were returning. The priests of Amun were regaining their influence. And somewhere in the middle of this enormous transformation stood a child, Tutankhamun. He could not have understood the full political storm surrounding his throne. He was too young. Yet his name, his religious identity, and even his royal residence became part of a deliberate attempt to repair Egypt. The young king was moved away from the world created by Akhenaten. The capital was abandoned. The traditional temples were restored. And the memory of the Amarna period began to disappear. But restoring Egypt's old religion was not enough. The royal family itself had become a problem. Akhenaten had broken with tradition so dramatically that the normal line of succession became difficult to understand. There were several royal figures whose exact identities remain debated, and among them is the mysterious Smenkhkare. For decades, Egyptologists have wondered whether Smenkhkare was a separate male pharaoh, a short-lived co-ruler, or somehow connected to Nefertiti. The evidence is frustrating. There are names. There are royal titles. There are fragments of inscriptions, but no complete story. And then there is Neferuaten. This name appears during the same confusing period. Some scholars believe Neferuaten may have been Nefertiti herself, possibly ruling under a different name after Akhenaten's death. Others argue that the evidence points to another royal woman. The possibility is extraordinary. Could one of the most famous queens in Egyptian history have transformed herself from royal consort into pharaoh? Could Nefertiti have ruled Egypt directly during the transition between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun? If so, why was her reign almost completely erased? The answer may lie in the political climate of the time. Ancient Egypt depended heavily on religious legitimacy. The pharaoh was not simply a political leader. He was supposed to maintain order between humanity and the divine world. Akhenaten had challenged that entire concept. He had elevated the Aten while attacking the power of traditional temples. For the priests and officials whose authority depended on the old religious system, this was more than a theological disagreement. It was a threat to their position. After Akhenaten's death, reversing his policies could therefore have been essential for the survival of the state. And Tutankhamun became the perfect symbol for that reversal. He was young. He could be guided. His reign could be presented as a restoration rather than a continuation of Akhenaten's revolution. But behind the young king stood adults who understood exactly how fragile the situation was. One of the most important was Ai. Ai was an influential official who had served during the Amarna period and later became pharaoh himself. Another powerful figure was Horemheb, a military commander who would eventually become king. Together with other officials, they helped guide Egypt through the transition. And this is where the story becomes darker. Because when Horemheb eventually became pharaoh, he did something extraordinary. He treated the reigns of Akhenaten and his immediate successors as if they had never happened. Their names were omitted from official king lists. Their monuments were dismantled. Their inscriptions were destroyed or reused. The Amarna kings were effectively removed from the royal history of Egypt. Imagine what that means. Thousands of years later, historians are trying to reconstruct a period that ancient Egyptians themselves deliberately tried to erase. It is almost like finding a book where several chapters have been ripped out. We can see the pages before the missing section. We can see what came afterward. But the crucial middle is gone. And Nefertiti sits directly inside that missing space. Yet perhaps the most fascinating clues come from Tutankhamun's own tomb. When Howard Carter entered the tomb in 1922, he discovered something far more complicated than a simple royal burial. The tomb was filled with treasures: gold, weapons, chariots, furniture, jewelry, ritual objects. But the burial chamber itself was surprisingly small for a pharaoh. This has led some researchers to suggest that the tomb may not have originally been designed for Tutankhamun. Perhaps it belonged to someone else. Maybe a high-ranking official. Maybe a royal woman. Or perhaps it was simply an unfinished tomb hurriedly adapted after the young king's unexpected death. And that possibility raises another question. If Tutankhamun died suddenly at a young age, where was his original burial supposed to be? Could another tomb have been prepared for him? Could a larger royal complex still be hidden somewhere in the Valley of the Kings? And could that hidden tomb be connected to the missing members of his family? For years, researchers have searched for answers. One of the most famous theories involves Nefertiti. Some scholars once suggested that a hidden chamber might exist beyond Tutankhamun's burial chamber, and that this could potentially contain the remains of Nefertiti. The idea attracted enormous attention. Radar scans were carried out inside the tomb. At one point, researchers believed they had detected possible hidden spaces. But later investigations produced conflicting results. The evidence remains disputed. No confirmed hidden burial chamber containing Nefertiti has been discovered. And that uncertainty is important, because archaeology is not about finding the most exciting explanation. It is about proving what the evidence actually supports. Still, the possibility is enough to keep the mystery alive, because Tutankhamun's tomb may itself be a clue to how chaotic this period really was. The young king died before he could complete a long reign. He left no surviving adult heir. His death created another succession crisis, and the people who followed him would eventually reshape Egyptian history once again. I became pharaoh, then Horemheb. And after Horemheb, a new royal dynasty emerged. The Amarna family disappeared. Their city disappeared. Their religion disappeared. Their names were attacked. But one person remained impossible to erase completely: Nefertiti. Her famous bust survived. Her name survived on fragments. Her images survived in broken reliefs. And her mystery survived even more strongly. But there is another clue that brings us back to Tutankhamun: his DNA. Modern scientific analysis has allowed researchers to reconstruct parts of the royal family tree using genetic evidence from ancient mummies. The results revealed that Tutankhamun's parents were closely related. His mother was identified as the so-called younger lady, a mummy discovered in a royal tomb. His father was identified as the mummy of Akhenaten. But the identity of the younger lady remains one of the most fascinating pieces of the puzzle. She was closely related to Akhenaten, yet she has not been conclusively identified as Nefertiti. In fact, genetic evidence has made the royal family both clearer and more confusing at the same time. We now know more about Tutankhamun's biological ancestry than ever before. But knowing who his parents were does not automatically explain who Nefertiti was in the final years of her life. And that is the problem with ancient mysteries. Every answer can create another question. We know Tutankhamun was connected directly to Akhenaten. We know he lived during the aftermath of the Amarna Revolution. We know the old religion returned during his reign. We know Nefertiti was enormously important during Akhenaten's rule. But we still do not know exactly where she went. And perhaps the answer lies not in one spectacular discovery, but in the wider archaeological landscape. The lost Golden City shows us the complexity of Egyptian society during this era. Amarna shows us the revolutionary royal capital. Tutankhamun's tomb shows us the extraordinary wealth of the royal family. The royal mummies show us biological relationships. And damaged inscriptions reveal a deliberate attempt to control historical memory. Together, these pieces create something remarkable: a civilization trying to rewrite its own past. That may be why Nefertiti is so difficult to find. If her final years were politically inconvenient, later rulers may have had every reason to erase them. Her tomb could have been destroyed. Her monuments could have been dismantled. Her name could have been removed. Or perhaps her burial was simply hidden somewhere that modern archaeology has not yet reached. And there is one final possibility. Maybe we are looking for Nefertiti in the wrong place. Perhaps she was not buried in the Valley of the Kings at all. Maybe she died before Tutankhamun became king. Maybe she was buried near Akhenaten. Maybe her remains were moved later. Or perhaps she lies inside a chamber that has not yet been discovered. The desert has already proven that it can hide entire cities. It concealed workshops, homes, tools, and royal secrets for thousands of years. So imagining that another royal tomb remains hidden is not impossible. But until archaeologists find physical evidence, it remains only a possibility. And this is where the mystery becomes more than a story about one missing queen. It becomes a story about memory itself. The ancient Egyptians spent enormous effort trying to make their names eternal. They carved their identities into stone because they believed that being remembered was part of continuing to exist. Horemheb tried to erase Akhenaten. Yet today, millions of people know Akhenaten's name. The rulers who tried to destroy his memory failed. And Nefertiti may have suffered the same fate. Her world disappeared. Her city became ruins. Her religious revolution collapsed. Her final resting place remains unknown. But more than 3,000 years later, people are still searching for her. Perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. The people who tried to erase her from history may have accidentally created one of its greatest mysteries. And now, every newly uncovered wall, every royal seal, every forgotten burial, and every hidden chamber brings us one step closer to understanding what happened during those lost years. But the most dangerous secrets of ancient Egypt are not always buried beneath pyramids. Sometimes they are hidden inside the tombs of the dead. And one of those tombs would eventually reveal a discovery so extraordinary that it would change everything we thought we knew about Tutankhamun's family. The tomb of Tutankhamun was supposed to be the final resting place of a forgotten boy king. Instead, when Howard Carter entered it in 1922, he opened a doorway into one of the most complicated royal families in human history. Behind the gold and glittering treasures was something far more valuable than wealth: evidence. Every object had been placed there for a reason. Every fragment of decoration carried a message. And every unusual detail raised another question. Who prepared this burial? Why was the tomb so small for a pharaoh? Why did some objects appear to have been made for someone else? And most importantly, could the tomb contain clues about the mysterious people who came before Tutankhamun? When Carter first entered the burial chamber, the world saw gold. But archaeologists saw a puzzle. Tutankhamun's famous golden mask became the symbol of ancient Egypt almost overnight. Yet the mask itself may have originally been intended for someone else. Some researchers have pointed to modifications in the inscriptions and construction, suggesting that certain burial objects may have been repurposed after the young king's unexpected death. That possibility matters, because Tutankhamun did not live long enough to build the enormous royal tomb that later pharaohs would receive. He died when he was probably still in his late teens. His reign had lasted roughly a decade. For an Egyptian pharaoh, that was barely enough time to establish a lasting legacy. Then suddenly, everything had to happen at once. The body had to be prepared. The funeral rituals had to be completed. The tomb had to be decorated. Thousands of objects had to be assembled. And the royal succession had to be secured. If Tutankhamun's death was unexpected, his burial may have been organized in a hurry. That could explain why objects from other royal individuals appear inside the tomb. And one object in particular has fascinated researchers for decades. A small golden coffin was discovered inside the burial complex containing a fetus. Actually, 2 fetal mummies were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. The discovery was heartbreaking. They were tiny, fragile, and they were almost certainly connected to Tutankhamun and his wife, Ankhesenamun. The young king had no surviving heir. These two children may have been his daughters. Their presence reveals something that the gold cannot hide. Behind the image of the powerful pharaoh was a young man whose family life was marked by tragedy. Tutankhamun's marriage to Ankhesenamun also connects him directly to the Amarna royal family. She was the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. That means the young king was not simply restoring Egypt's traditional religion. He was also marrying within the same royal family that had created the religious revolution. The connection between Tutankhamun and Nefertiti therefore becomes even more intriguing. If Ankhesenamun was Nefertiti's daughter, then Nefertiti was part of the immediate family surrounding the young pharaoh. But where was she? That question remains unanswered. And then there is another strange detail. Tutankhamun's tomb contains representations of royal figures whose identities and relationships have been debated for generations. Some objects bear names that appear to have been altered. Some images seem to have been adapted. Some inscriptions were overwritten. This was not unusual in ancient Egypt. When political circumstances changed, objects could be reused. But during this particular period, the practice takes on a deeper meaning. The royal family was trying to move on from the Amarna revolution. And perhaps the tomb itself became a place where different chapters of Egyptian history collided. The old religion, the new religion, the forgotten royal family, the restored kingdom, all buried together. Then came the scientific revolution that transformed our understanding of Tutankhamun's family. Modern technology allowed researchers to examine royal mummies without destroying them. CT scans revealed injuries, diseases, and physical characteristics that could never have been understood from the outside. DNA analysis went even further. Researchers were able to compare genetic material from several royal mummies and reconstruct relationships within the 18th dynasty. The results confirmed that Tutankhamun was the son of Akhenaten. They also revealed that his parents were closely related. This close genetic relationship may have contributed to the young king's physical vulnerabilities. Tutankhamun suffered from several medical conditions. His skeleton showed evidence of problems affecting his feet. He appears to have had difficulty walking. The discovery of numerous walking sticks inside his tomb may not have been symbolic decoration. They may have been practical objects that he actually used. And then there was malaria. Genetic and biological evidence suggests that Tutankhamun suffered from malaria infections. The exact cause of his death remains debated, but researchers believe several factors may have contributed. A weakened body, genetic vulnerabilities, possible infection, and perhaps an injury. The romantic image of a mysterious pharaoh dying under supernatural circumstances is far less dramatic than the reality, but it is also far more human. Tutankhamun was not an immortal golden king. He was a sick young man, and yet when he died, Egypt had to transform his short life into the eternal image of a pharaoh. That was the purpose of the tomb. The body had to become more than a body. It had to become the vessel of a king's eternal existence. And this is where the ancient Egyptian obsession with death becomes important. The Egyptians did not think of death as simple disappearance. They believed existence continued beyond the grave. The tomb was therefore not merely a place to hide the dead. It was a carefully constructed world. Food, clothing, weapons, furniture, jewelry, chariots, walking sticks, cosmetics, even objects connected to everyday life. Everything had a purpose. The dead king would need these things in the afterlife. This explains why Tutankhamun's tomb was packed with objects. But it also creates another mystery. If the tomb was prepared quickly, where did all these objects come from? Some may have been specifically created for him. Others may have been reused. And some appear to have originally belonged to other members of the royal family. That possibility brings us back to Nefertiti. Could some of the objects connected to her have been recycled into Tutankhamun's burial? If so, They may represent some of the few surviving physical traces of a queen whose later history was deliberately erased. One of the most fascinating objects connected to this period is a famous painted wooden head depicting a young royal figure. Another is the well-known image of Nefertiti and Akhenaten beneath the rays of the Aten. These works show a royal family unlike anything that came before. They are intimate. Akhenaten and Nefertiti are sometimes shown holding their daughters. They kiss them. They sit together. The children appear close to their parents. This is striking because Egyptian royal art had traditionally emphasized idealized power and eternal order. The Amarna artists introduced something different: family, emotion, movement, and perhaps vulnerability. The images make the royal family feel strangely modern, but they also make their disappearance more haunting. We can see their faces. We can see their children. We can see the world they created, but we cannot follow them to the end. Nefertiti vanishes. Akhenaten dies. Their city is abandoned. Tutankhamun becomes king. And within a few decades, the entire Amarna period is treated almost like an embarrassing memory. Yet the archaeological evidence refuses to disappear. The city of Amarna still exists. The lost golden city still exists. The tomb of Tutankhamun still exists. And beneath the desert are potentially thousands of objects that have never been discovered. That is why the search for Nefertiti remains so important. Finding her would not simply give us a mummy. It could provide a missing connection between several major events in Egyptian history. It could tell us whether she survived Akhenaten. It could reveal how she was buried. It could clarify the succession. It could tell us whether she became a ruler herself. And perhaps it could explain why her name disappeared from the official record. But there is an even bigger possibility. What if her tomb was never meant to be found? Ancient Egyptian royal burials were sometimes hidden or relocated. Bodies could be moved when tombs became vulnerable to robbery. Royal mummies were sometimes gathered into hidden caches for protection. This is exactly what happened to many New Kingdom pharaohs. Their original tombs were not always their final resting places. Centuries after their deaths, priests moved royal bodies into secret locations to protect them from grave robbers. This means that even if Nefertiti had a tomb, her body could have been moved somewhere else. And that makes the search exponentially more difficult. We are not necessarily looking for one tomb. We may be looking for a chain of burials, relocations, and hidden chambers stretching across centuries. But there is another reason archaeologists remain optimistic. Egypt still has enormous unexplored areas. New technologies can detect structures beneath the ground without immediately destroying them. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetic surveys, electrical resistivity, advanced imaging, even satellite observations. These tools are changing archaeology. Instead of simply digging blindly into the desert, researchers can first map what lies beneath it. And sometimes, the ground itself reveals something unexpected. A wall, a corridor, a void, a chamber, a forgotten structure. Perhaps one day technology will detect the exact place where Nefertiti was buried. But until that day comes, the mystery remains. And perhaps that is what makes her story so powerful. Tutankhamun gave the world a tomb. Akhenaten left behind a ruined city. Nefertiti left behind a face. A beautiful face carved more than 3,000 years ago that somehow survived the destruction of her world. But a face is not a life. And the life of Nefertiti remains hidden behind one of the greatest gaps in Egyptian history. The lost golden city gives us a glimpse of the world around her. Tutankhamun's tomb gives us a glimpse of what came afterward. But between those two worlds is a missing chapter. And somewhere inside that chapter may be the answer. Because perhaps the greatest secret about Nefertiti is not simply where she died. It is what happened to her after she disappeared from the records. Was she forgotten? Was she erased? Was she secretly powerful? Did she guide the young king? Or did she die before the final collapse of Akhenaten's world? The evidence remains incomplete. But archaeology has already taught us one important lesson. The desert does not forget. It only waits. And beneath the sand, another royal secret may still be sleeping. If a tomb can remain silent for 3,000 years, then what happens when that silence is finally broken? What if the answer is not just another mummy, another golden mask, or another forgotten name, but a clue connecting one of Egypt's most mysterious queens with the boy king who became the most famous pharaoh in history? Beneath the sands of Egypt, archaeologists continue to uncover places that seem to belong to a world we thought we already understood. Yet every sealed chamber creates another question. Every artifact forces historians to reconsider an old assumption. And sometimes, the smallest object can completely change the story. The lost city of Aten, the shadow of Nefertiti, the short reign of Tutankhamun, and the extraordinary tombs discovered across Egypt, Peru, Bulgaria, Greece, and beyond may seem like separate mysteries. But together, they reveal something far more unsettling. The ancient world was not nearly as simple as the surviving monuments make it appear, and some of its most important secrets may still be waiting beneath the ground. For thousands of years, the dead have been better at keeping secrets than the living. A sealed tomb closes only once. Then darkness takes over. Inside, an entire world can disappear from human memory. A ruler dies. A kingdom collapses. Languages change. Cities become buried beneath sand and stone. Generations pass, and eventually nobody remembers who built the chamber, who entered it, or why its treasures were placed there. But the tomb remembers. It remembers the weapons carried by warriors. It remembers the jewelry worn by queens. It remembers the food prepared for the journey into the afterlife. It remembers the strange rituals that the living believed would protect the dead. And sometimes, it even remembers things that ancient writers never recorded. That is why archaeology is not simply about finding old objects. It is about listening to the dead. One of the most extraordinary examples comes from ancient Egypt, where a forgotten city has opened a new window into the world of the pharaohs. The city is known today as Aten. It was discovered in 2020 near Luxor, not far from the famous Valley of the Kings. Archaeologists initially expected to find something interesting, perhaps another collection of ruins buried beneath the desert. Instead, they uncovered an entire ancient settlement. Walls appeared beneath the sand. Rooms emerged. Workshops, residential areas, administrative buildings, a bakery, tools, pottery, everyday objects. This was not simply a royal monument built to impress future generations. It was a city where ordinary people actually lived. And that distinction matters. The monuments of Egypt often tell us about kings. The houses tell us about everyone else. The streets tell us how people moved. The workshops tell us what they produced. The ovens tell us what they ate. The discarded objects tell us what they used every day. And the walls reveal how organized this society really was. The city dates to the reign of Amenhotep III and the period surrounding his successor, Akhenaten. That places it directly inside one of the most dramatic periods in Egyptian history. Because this was the world of Nefertiti. And it was also the world into which Tutankhamun was born. For generations, historians have struggled to understand what really happened during this turbulent period. Amenhotep III had ruled over an immensely powerful Egypt. Then his son, Akhenaten, changed almost everything. The traditional gods were pushed aside. The worship of the Aten, represented by the solar disk, became central. A new capital was created at Amarna. The royal family moved away from the traditional centers of Egyptian power. And beside Akhenaten stood one of the most mysterious women in ancient history, Nefertiti. Her face is famous. Her identity is not. We have her portraits. We know her name. We know she was enormously important. But the final years of her life remain strangely uncertain. When exactly did she disappear? Did she die before Akhenaten? Did she continue ruling under another name? Could she have survived into the transition that followed? And what role did she play in the early life of Tutankhamun? Those questions have fascinated Egyptologists for decades. Tutankhamun himself became pharaoh while still a child. His reign was short. His tomb was comparatively small for a king. And yet his burial became one of the most famous archaeological discoveries ever made. When Howard Carter entered the tomb in 1922, he found a world of extraordinary wealth. Gold, furniture, weapons, chariots, statues, jewelry, and the famous golden funerary mask that would become one of the defining images of ancient Egypt. But Tutankhamun's tomb created almost as many mysteries as it solved. Why was the tomb so small? Was it originally intended for someone else? Were some of its burial objects prepared for another royal individual? And why did the young king die so early? The answers remain incomplete. But the discovery of the lost city of Aten gives researchers something that Tutankhamun's tomb could never provide: context. The city allows archaeologists to see the world around the royal family. Not just the final burial, not just the polished monuments, but the machinery of everyday life. The people who baked bread, the workers who built structures, the craftsmen who created objects, the officials who controlled supplies. The city itself becomes a kind of time capsule. And that is where the story becomes truly fascinating. Because the closer we get to the ordinary world of ancient Egypt, the less certain the familiar story becomes. The pharaohs were not living in isolation. Their palaces depended on enormous networks of workers, administrators, craftsmen, priests, farmers, soldiers, and traders. Behind every golden statue was an industrial system. Behind every monumental temple was a workforce. Behind every royal burial was an entire culture of death. And every tomb was built according to beliefs that were far more complicated than the simple idea of preserving a body. The Egyptians believed death was a transformation. The body had to be protected. The name had to survive. The memory of the individual had to remain alive. Food and objects could accompany the dead. Images could become symbolic substitutes. Words could provide protection. And the tomb itself became a bridge between two worlds. That is why what archaeologists find inside these tombs can be so revealing. Consider the tomb of Tutankhamun. Among the treasures was a small iron dagger. At first glance, it might not seem as impressive as the gold surrounding it, but its material made it extraordinary. Iron was extremely rare in Egypt during Tutankhamun's time. So where did this particular metal come from? Scientific analysis provided the answer. The blade contained unusually high levels of nickel and cobalt, characteristics consistent with meteoritic iron. In other words, the dagger was forged from material that had fallen from the sky. To modern eyes, that is fascinating. To the ancient Egyptians, it may have been something much more profound. This was literally metal from the heavens, a substance that came from beyond the ordinary human world. The dagger was not simply a weapon. It may have carried symbolic meaning, a connection between the king and the heavens, between death and the gods, between earth and the celestial world. And this is exactly why ancient tombs are so powerful. An object does not need to be large to tell an enormous story. Sometimes it only needs to be made from the right material. The same principle appears thousands of kilometers away. In Peru, Archaeologists uncovered the tomb of the Lord of Sipan. The discovery transformed our understanding of the Moche civilization. The burial was filled with gold, silver, precious stones, ornaments, weapons, and elaborate ceremonial objects. But the true revelation was the complexity of the society that produced them. The Lord of Sipan was not simply buried with wealth. He was surrounded by people who appear to have accompanied him into death. Women, warriors, a child, and even a dog. The burial reflected a world in which death did not necessarily mean the end of service. The ruler's status continued beyond life. His political and religious identity had to be preserved, and the people buried around him may have been part of that belief system. Thousands of years later, the discovery forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Ancient civilizations were capable of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary brutality at the same time. The same people who created delicate gold ornaments could also participate in violent rituals. The same society that celebrated its rulers could demand terrible sacrifices. And this contradiction appears again and again in the archaeological record. Perhaps nowhere is that contradiction more disturbing than in ancient Ur. When archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated the royal cemetery, he uncovered breathtaking treasures: gold, jewelry, musical instruments, weapons, royal objects. But nearby was something far darker: a mass burial containing dozens of individuals. For years, scholars imagined that these people had willingly followed their rulers into the afterlife, perhaps after consuming poison. Later analysis suggested something more violent. Some skulls showed signs of severe trauma. The peaceful image of mass voluntary death became much harder to defend. Were these people sacrificed? Were they killed as part of a royal ceremony? Did they believe they were entering another existence? Or were they simply victims of a system in which the ruler's death mattered more than their own? We may never know. And that is one of archaeology's cruelest realities. The evidence can survive. The answers may not. But even when the dead refuse to explain themselves, their remains still challenge our assumptions. In Bulgaria, the Varna necropolis offers another extraordinary example. The burials date back roughly 6,500 years. That means the gold discovered there predates the pyramids by thousands of years. Some graves contained astonishing quantities of worked gold. One individual was buried with more than a kilogram of the precious metal. The discovery demonstrated that social inequality, political authority, and extreme wealth existed much earlier than many researchers once imagined. But there is an even stranger detail. Some graves contained no human body at all, only objects, gold masks, symbols, empty spaces where a person should have been. Were these symbolic burials? Were they created for individuals whose bodies could not be recovered? Or did they represent something we still do not understand? Again, the tomb gives us evidence, but it refuses to give us the complete story. And perhaps that is why the mystery of Nefertiti continues to endure. Because we have fragments: a city, a royal family, a young king, a powerful queen, a sudden religious revolution, a mysterious transition, and then silence. The lost city of Aten may not contain a magical answer hidden inside one secret chamber. It may reveal something more valuable: the world in which these people actually lived, the world behind the statues, behind the gold, behind the royal names, and somewhere inside that forgotten world may be another clue: a fragment of pottery, a seal, a workshop, a burial, a name carved into stone, something small enough to overlook, yet powerful enough to change the story. Because the greatest archaeological discoveries rarely announce themselves. They wait, buried beneath the earth, covered by sand, protected by darkness, until one day someone finally finds them. And when that happens, the dead speak again, not with voices, with evidence. And sometimes, that evidence is enough to make history question everything it thought it knew. For thousands of years, the desert has been hiding more than cities and temples. It has also been hiding questions. Questions about who ruled, who worshipped, who fought, and who was quietly erased from the official story. And nowhere is that silence more powerful than inside an ancient tomb. A tomb was never simply a place where the dead were placed. To the ancient Egyptians, it was a carefully constructed passage between worlds. Every object had a purpose. Every symbol carried meaning. Every piece of jewelry could represent protection. Every weapon could prepare the deceased for the next life. And every inscription could preserve a name that the living feared would otherwise disappear forever. But sometimes the people buried inside these chambers leave behind clues that challenge everything we thought we knew. One of the most remarkable examples comes from Peru, where archaeologists discovered the remains of a woman who appeared to have held a position of enormous power. She became known as the Lady of Cao. Her burial was discovered at the archaeological complex of El Brujo, along the northern coast of Peru. At first, researchers had no reason to expect anything extraordinary. The desert had preserved countless secrets beneath its surface. But when they carefully opened the burial, they discovered a remarkably preserved mummy. The dry climate had protected her body for nearly 2,000 years. Then came the details that changed the story. Her arms and hands were covered with elaborate tattoos, snakes, spiders, geometric symbols, images that may have carried religious or political meanings. Nearby were ceremonial objects and weapons. And suddenly an old assumption began to collapse. For a long time, scholars had imagined that political and military power in the Moche civilization belonged primarily to men. But the Lady of Cao suggested something very different. This woman may have been a ruler, perhaps a priestess, perhaps a warrior, perhaps all three. Her burial contained symbols of authority that were difficult to explain if she had been an ordinary member of society. She had been treated as someone important, someone whose identity mattered, someone whose journey into the afterlife required extraordinary preparation. And that raises a fascinating question. If one powerful woman could remain hidden beneath the desert for nearly 2,000 years, how many others might still be waiting beneath unexplored ground? The discovery of the Lady of Cao is important because ancient history is often reconstructed from incomplete evidence. A historian reads a surviving inscription. An archaeologist studies a monument. A researcher compares burial practices. But what happens when the evidence itself has been misunderstood? For centuries, people have looked at ancient societies through modern assumptions. Men were rulers. Women were secondary. Kings commanded. Workers obeyed. Priests controlled religion. And ordinary people simply followed. But archaeology keeps breaking those simple categories apart. The deeper we dig, the more complicated ancient civilization becomes. And this is especially true when we examine tombs, because a tomb can reveal things that official records never mention. A ruler might have presented himself as invincible during life, but his burial might reveal fear. A civilization might appear peaceful in its monuments, but its graves might contain weapons and evidence of violence. A society might seem technologically primitive. Then archaeologists uncover objects so sophisticated that the old description suddenly becomes meaningless. That brings us back to one of the strangest burial discoveries ever made: the Griffin warrior. In 2015, archaeologists working near the ancient Greek city of Pylos uncovered a burial that had remained undisturbed for more than 3,000 years. Inside was a wealthy warrior from the Mycenaean world. The grave contained thousands of objects: gold rings, weapons, jewelry, precious stones. And among the artifacts was something tiny: a small stone seal. At first, it looked almost insignificant. It was only a few centimeters long. The surface was covered with layers of hardened mineral deposits accumulated over centuries. The restoration process took months. Slowly, carefully, researchers removed the ancient buildup. Then the image appeared. 3 warriors engaged in combat. The scene was astonishingly detailed. The muscles of the bodies, the weapons, the movement, the clothing. Even tiny elements of the composition had been carved with extraordinary precision. Some details were less than a millimeter across, and that created an immediate problem. How could a Bronze Age craftsman produce something so precise? There were no modern microscopes, no precision cutting machines, no industrial magnification systems. Yet the artist had created a miniature scene with a level of detail that seemed far beyond what researchers had expected from the period. The discovery forced scholars to reconsider the relationship between the Mycenaean world and the Minoan civilization of Crete. Perhaps the Mycenaeans were not simply isolated warriors who developed their culture independently. Perhaps they were connected to an older network of artistic and technological knowledge. Perhaps skilled craftsmen were moving between islands and mainland kingdoms. Ideas were traveling. Techniques were traveling. And knowledge that we assumed appeared much later may actually have existed much earlier. The little seal became a message from a world we had misunderstood. And this is one of the reasons ancient tombs are so dangerous to our assumptions. They don't care what historians expect to find. They simply preserve what happened. Another remarkable example comes from the frozen mountains of Central Asia. In 1993, archaeologist Natalia Polosmak was working in the Altai Mountains near the borderlands of Russia, Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan. The landscape was harsh, cold, windy, remote. And beneath an ancient burial mound, researchers discovered something almost impossible. A human body preserved in ice. A young woman. Her skin had survived. Her hair had survived. Her clothing had survived. And most remarkably, tattoos remained visible on her skin. The tattoos depicted fantastic animals, creatures that looked almost mythical. The woman became known as the Siberian Ice Maiden. The frozen environment had acted like a natural time capsule. Instead of decaying like most ancient bodies, she had been locked inside the ice. For more than 2,000 years, the cold had protected her. Near her were several horses. Their presence suggested that the burial had been carefully prepared for an important person. Her clothing also revealed something remarkable. Some of the textiles had come from distant regions. This suggested that the communities living in these remote mountains were not isolated from the wider ancient world. Trade networks crossed enormous distances. People exchanged materials. Ideas moved along with them. Luxury textiles could travel across mountains and deserts. And somewhere along those routes, cultures met. But the discovery created controversy. For the people living in the region, the frozen woman was not simply an archaeological specimen. She was part of their ancestral landscape. Some believed disturbing her burial had brought misfortune, earthquakes, illness, bad weather. The scientific community viewed these events differently. But the conflict revealed something important. Ancient remains do not belong only to science. They also belong to memory, to identity, to cultural traditions. And sometimes, the question is not simply whether archaeologists can excavate a grave. The question is whether they should. The same problem appears in Egypt. Ancient tombs have been opened repeatedly throughout history. Some were discovered by archaeologists. Others were found by treasure hunters. And many were destroyed by people looking for gold. The tragedy is that a looted tomb loses more than objects. It loses information. The position of a necklace can tell archaeologists how a person was dressed. The location of a weapon can reveal how it was placed during burial. Food remains can reveal what people ate. Bones can reveal disease, injuries, age, and physical activity. Even tiny fragments can provide evidence about trade. Once everything is removed and scattered, much of that information disappears forever. That is why an untouched tomb is so valuable. It is not simply a treasure chest. It is a frozen moment. Everything is still where someone placed it. Thousands of years ago, an ancient person might have stood inside a chamber holding an object. They might have placed it beside the body. They might have whispered a prayer. They might have sealed the entrance. Then they walked away, and nobody returned. Until thousands of years later. This is exactly what happened at Sutton Hoo in England. In 1939, archaeologists uncovered the imprint of a massive ship buried beneath a mound. The wooden vessel itself had almost completely disappeared, but the soil preserved its shape. The ship was enormous, roughly 27 meters long. It had been dragged inland and transformed into a burial chamber for someone of extraordinary status. Inside were weapons, silver objects, gold ornaments, and one of the most famous helmets ever discovered. The Sutton Hoo helmet. Its reconstructed face appears almost otherworldly. A fierce expression. A stylized mustache. Animal imagery. A symbol of power from a world that existed before England became the country we know today. But there was one enormous mystery. There was no body. The burial was spectacular. The ship was real. The objects were real. But the person who had been buried there had vanished. The acidic soil had destroyed the bones. Only the outline remained. A human-shaped absence. And sometimes absence is more mysterious than presence. Who was the person? Was it King Radwald? Was it another powerful ruler? Was the burial intended as a memorial rather than a conventional grave? We cannot be completely certain. But the artifacts reveal something extraordinary. This early medieval society was connected to a much wider world. Objects from distant regions demonstrate long-distance trade. The wealth of the burial reveals political power. And the craftsmanship demonstrates that the so-called Dark Ages were not nearly as dark as later generations imagined. Across thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, the pattern keeps repeating. A tomb is opened. An object appears. A theory collapses. A new mystery begins. And perhaps the most disturbing example is hidden in Egypt. Among the ancient mummies discovered, there is one whose face appears frozen in a scream. Researchers have called him Unknown Man E. His mouth is open. His expression is horrifying. His body was not prepared like the carefully preserved remains of a wealthy nobleman. He was wrapped in sheepskin, a material that carried negative associations in ancient Egyptian culture. Why was he treated so differently? One theory connects him to a royal conspiracy during the reign of Ramesses III. Ancient records describe a plot against the pharaoh. Members of the royal household were accused of participating. One of the conspirators may have been a son of the king. And some researchers have proposed that Unknown Man E could have been that individual. If so, his unusual burial may have been deliberate. Not an honored journey into the afterlife. A punishment that continued even after death. His body may have been denied the traditional rituals that were supposed to guarantee eternal existence. Instead of being protected with care, he may have been deliberately abandoned to the consequences of his supposed crime. But there is another possibility. His expression may simply be the result of the way his body decomposed and dried. The open mouth does not necessarily prove that he died screaming. And this is where archaeology must resist the temptation to turn mystery into certainty. A terrifying appearance does not automatically mean a terrifying death. A strange burial does not automatically prove a conspiracy. And an unexplained object does not automatically require an impossible explanation. The real mystery is often more complicated. Because the ancient world does not need supernatural answers to be extraordinary. Human beings were already capable of creating civilizations, rituals, technologies, wars, art, and monuments on a scale that still amazes us. And every tomb we uncover gives us another glimpse into that complexity. The lost city of Aten may help us understand the world of Nefertiti and Tutankhamun. The Lady of Kau challenges our assumptions about women and power. The Griffin Warrior reveals unexpected artistic sophistication. The Ice Maiden exposes ancient trade networks and cultural memory. Sutton Hoo demonstrates the wealth and complexity of early medieval Europe. And Unknown Man E reminds us that even death could become part of a political struggle. But there are still countless graves beneath the earth. Some have never been located. Some have been located but never opened. And others may already have been disturbed so completely that their stories are almost impossible to reconstruct. Somewhere beneath Egypt's desert, Peru's valleys, Europe's ancient hills, and Asia's frozen mountains, another chamber may be waiting. Its walls may still be intact. Its objects may still be exactly where they were placed. And its secrets may have survived every empire, every war, every earthquake, and every generation that came before us. The question is not whether the past still has secrets. It clearly does. The real question is how many of those secrets are still waiting for someone to listen. For more than 3,000 years, one question has followed the royal family of ancient Egypt like a shadow. What happened to Nefertiti? She was powerful enough to stand beside Akhenaten during one of the most radical religious transformations in Egyptian history. Her face became immortalized in stone. Her name appeared in royal inscriptions. She was portrayed not as a silent wife, but as a figure of authority. And then, almost suddenly, she disappears. No confirmed tomb, no undisputed mummy, no universally accepted final resting place, just silence. But what if the answer has been sitting beneath the Egyptian desert all along? The discovery of the lost city of Aten has given archaeologists something they desperately needed: context. Instead of looking only at royal monuments, researchers can now examine the physical world surrounding the people who created them. The streets, the workshops, the storage rooms, the homes, the objects left behind by workers who had no reason to believe that thousands of years later, strangers would be studying their discarded possessions. And somewhere inside this forgotten city may be a clue to the royal family that changed Egypt forever. The story begins with a king who wanted to reshape reality itself. Amenhotep IV became Akhenaten. He rejected the traditional religious order and elevated the Aten above the old gods. The change was enormous. Egyptian religion had been built around a complex network of deities for centuries. Amun, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Ra, and countless others. Then Akhenaten introduced something radically different. The Aten became the center of royal worship. The king and his family positioned themselves as intermediaries between the divine force and the Egyptian people. A new capital was established at Akhetaten, the city we now call Amarna. It was built rapidly. Temples were constructed. Palaces appeared. Administrative buildings were created. The royal family moved there, and Nefertiti stood at the center of it all. Her images show her participating in rituals. She appears beside Akhenaten. She is sometimes shown performing acts normally associated with kings. She even appears wearing the symbols of authority. This was not the image of a queen who simply watched from behind the throne. She was part of the royal religious revolution. But the revolution did not last. After Akhenaten's death, the old religious order began returning. The capital at Amarna was abandoned. The temples associated with the Aten were dismantled. The names of Akhenaten and other members of the royal family were erased or altered. The city that had once represented a new Egypt became a place that later generations wanted to forget. And that is precisely why the discovery of Aten is so important. Because buried beneath the sand are traces of the period before the revolution completely disappeared. Imagine walking through those ancient streets. You might see the remains of a workshop where craftsmen once worked, a doorway where someone entered thousands of years ago, a broken vessel discarded after use, a storage room where food was kept, a wall built by someone who could never have imagined that one day the city would vanish. The lost city gives us a glimpse of the machinery behind royal power. Because kings do not build cities alone. Behind every pharaoh stood thousands of workers. Farmers produced food. Craftsmen created objects. Officials controlled supplies. Builders constructed walls. Priests performed rituals. And scribes recorded information. The royal family may have appeared divine, but their world depended on ordinary human beings. That realization makes the disappearance of the city even more mysterious. Why was it abandoned? Was it simply part of the political changes following Akhenaten's death? Was the settlement connected to a broader shift in the royal court? Or did environmental and economic pressures also play a role? The evidence suggests that the transformation was complicated. And then came Tutankhamun. The boy king became ruler while still very young. His reign was short, but his historical importance is enormous. After the radical experiment of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's government restored the traditional gods. The old religious system returned. The Aten lost its privileged position. The royal court moved away from Amarna, and the city was gradually abandoned. Yet Tutankhamun himself remained connected to that earlier world. He had been born into it. He had grown up surrounded by the consequences of his father's religious revolution. And he became king at precisely the moment when Egypt was trying to reverse course. That makes his tomb even more fascinating. When Howard Carter discovered it in 1922, he entered a burial chamber filled with objects that had survived almost untouched. But the tomb may not have been designed specifically for Tutankhamun. Its layout is unusually modest for a king. Some scholars have suggested that parts of it may originally have been intended for someone else. Perhaps a high-ranking official, perhaps a royal woman, or perhaps another member of the Amarna royal family. This remains debated, but there is something undeniable about the burial. It was rushed compared with the enormous monuments associated with earlier rulers. Tutankhamun died unexpectedly young. His funeral preparations may have been completed under pressure, and some objects appear to have been adapted from earlier royal pieces. Names may have been changed. Decoration may have been repurposed. Objects made for one person may have been given to another. That means Tutankhamun's tomb may not be a perfect snapshot of one king. It may be a collection assembled from the complicated remains of an entire royal generation. And this raises a haunting possibility. Could some objects connected to Nefertiti or other members of the Amarna family have survived inside the tomb of Tutankhamun? Researchers have debated individual artifacts for decades. One famous example is the burial mask itself. Some researchers have questioned whether it was originally intended for Tutankhamun. Others argue that the evidence is not strong enough to support that conclusion. The debate continues, but it illustrates a much larger problem. The Amarna period was chaotic. Royal identities overlapped. Names were changed. Monuments were altered. Political loyalties shifted. And some individuals virtually disappeared from the historical record. Nefertiti is perhaps the most famous example. For years, researchers have searched for her tomb. One theory suggested that her burial could be connected to a hidden chamber inside Tutankhamun's tomb. The idea attracted enormous attention. Ground-penetrating radar and other technologies were used to investigate the possibility. At different points, scans appeared to suggest hidden spaces. Then other analyses challenged those interpretations. The supposed hidden chambers became one of archaeology's most debated mysteries. And while no secret chamber has definitively been proven to contain Nefertiti, The search itself reveals something important. Archaeologists are no longer limited to simply digging. Modern technology allows researchers to investigate monuments without immediately destroying them. Ground-penetrating radar can identify anomalies. 3D scanning can reveal hidden architectural features. Remote sensing can map buried structures. Chemical analysis can identify materials without cutting them apart. And advanced imaging can reveal details invisible to the naked eye. The past is being investigated with tools that would have looked like magic to the archaeologists of a century ago. But technology does not guarantee answers. Sometimes it creates more questions. A strange anomaly beneath the ground could be a chamber. It could be natural rock. It could be construction debris. It could be something completely unexpected. Archaeology is therefore a conversation between technology and interpretation. The machine detects something. The archaeologist asks what it means, and the evidence decides. This is particularly important when dealing with stories about Nefertiti, because she has become more than an archaeological figure. She has become a legend. Her famous bust transformed her into one of the most recognizable faces of the ancient world. But the real Nefertiti was not simply a beautiful woman frozen in limestone. She was a political figure, a religious figure, a member of a royal family caught inside a dangerous transformation. She lived through a period when Egypt itself was being forced to redefine its relationship with the gods. And perhaps she also witnessed the consequences when that experiment failed. Her disappearance may have been ordinary. She may have died. She may have been buried somewhere that has not yet been discovered. Her name may have been changed. Or her identity may have become merged with another royal figure. The possibilities are numerous. But there is one fact that makes the mystery especially compelling. Egyptian civilization was obsessed with preserving names. To erase someone's name was not merely to remove them from a monument. It could be an attempt to destroy their memory. So, when a royal figure disappears from the historical record, the absence itself becomes evidence. Someone may have wanted that silence. And the Amarna period contains an extraordinary amount of it. Akhenaten's monuments were dismantled. His name was attacked. His city was abandoned. His religious experiment was reversed. The royal family became politically inconvenient. And later generations rebuilt Egyptian history around a different narrative. But the desert preserved fragments. A city, a workshop, a seal, a broken statue, a piece of jewelry, a forgotten inscription. Each fragment survived because nobody bothered to destroy it. And together, these fragments are slowly rebuilding a world that ancient Egypt itself tried to bury. That is what makes the lost city of Aten so much more important than another archaeological discovery. It is not merely a collection of old walls. It is evidence from the exact period when Egypt was changing. It may help us understand how the royal court functioned, how workers lived, how resources were distributed, how religion affected daily life, and perhaps, indirectly, how the world of Nefertiti and Tutankhamun actually operated. But the deepest mystery remains. Somewhere beneath Egypt, there may still be a royal burial that has never been found. A chamber sealed before the political changes of the late 18th dynasty. A burial containing objects that could finally identify what happened to Nefertiti. Or perhaps the tomb has already been discovered, but we simply do not recognize it. Maybe the answer is not hidden behind a spectacular golden door. Maybe it is a damaged inscription, a forgotten name, a tiny seal, a fragment of royal jewelry. The ancient Egyptians built monuments designed to last forever. But history is rarely preserved in the way its creators intended. The greatest clues can survive in the most unexpected places. A worker's house, a broken jar, a discarded tool, a tiny piece of stone, and sometimes, beneath thousands of years of dust, an entire city. The dead do not speak, but they leave evidence. And as archaeologists continue to uncover Aten, the silence surrounding Nefertiti and Tutankhamun may become a little less silent, because every new discovery brings us closer to the people behind the legends. And perhaps one day, beneath the same desert that has protected their secrets for more than 3,000 years, someone will finally open a door that has been waiting since the age of the pharaohs. And behind it may be the answer to the question Egypt has been asking ever since Nefertiti disappeared. Where did the queen go? There is a strange moment that every archaeologist dreams about. You are standing in a place where no living human being has stood for thousands of years. The air is different. The silence feels heavier. Dust covers everything. And somewhere beneath your feet lies the final trace of a person whose name may have been forgotten before the civilization that buried them disappeared. Then the first object appears. A piece of gold. A weapon. A seal. A human bone. And suddenly the distance between the modern world and the ancient world seems to disappear. This is why tombs are so powerful. They preserve not only bodies but moments. A necklace placed around a person's neck, a knife positioned beside a warrior, a bowl of food prepared for the journey beyond death, a mask covering a face, a symbol carved into stone. Each object was deliberately chosen by someone who believed the dead would need it. And sometimes those objects reveal beliefs that no ancient text ever recorded. One of the most extraordinary examples comes from a place where the dead were preserved not by sophisticated embalming, but by nature itself. The frozen mountains of Central Asia. Thousands of years ago, communities lived across the enormous landscapes stretching between modern Siberia, Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan. They were not part of the great Egyptian kingdoms. They did not build pyramids. They left behind no giant temples that dominate the modern imagination. Yet their burial traditions reveal a world every bit as complex. Under ancient burial mounds called kurgans, archaeologists discovered bodies preserved by permafrost. And among the most famous was the woman now known as the Ice Maiden. Her body had been preserved so remarkably that researchers could still see her tattoos. The designs were not simple decorations. They showed fantastic creatures, including animals with antlers and powerful bodies. Were they symbols of status, religious markings, protection for the afterlife, or perhaps a visual record of the identity she carried during life? We cannot say with certainty. But tattoos are personal. They are placed directly onto the body. And unlike a golden necklace, they cannot simply be removed and passed to another person. The markings belonged to her. They were part of her identity. And because the frozen earth preserved them, we can still see a small part of how she wanted to be remembered. Her clothing revealed another secret. Some materials came from distant regions, demonstrating that these supposedly isolated mountain communities participated in long-distance exchange. Silk had traveled enormous distances. Luxury materials moved between cultures. The ancient world was far more connected than the map in our heads often suggests. Egypt traded with distant kingdoms. Mesopotamia exchanged goods across the Near East. Minoan and Mycenaean craftsmen influenced each other. Moche rulers controlled elaborate networks across Peru. And communities in the mountains of Central Asia were connected to distant lands through trade routes that existed long before the famous Silk Road. The ancient world was already global in ways we are only beginning to understand. But trade was not the only thing connecting civilizations. Ideas traveled too. Religious beliefs, artistic styles, weapons, burial customs, technological knowledge. And sometimes the similarities between distant cultures are so striking that archaeologists are forced to ask how these ideas moved from one place to another. That question becomes particularly fascinating when we return to Egypt. The Egyptians had developed an extraordinary culture of death. They did not simply bury their rulers. They prepared them. They wrapped them. They decorated them. They supplied them. And they built enormous monuments designed to preserve their memory. Yet even the Egyptians could not guarantee that a tomb would remain untouched. Grave robbers were one of the greatest threats to ancient burials. A tomb might be sealed with enormous stone blocks. It might contain curses. It might be hidden deep underground. But determined thieves could still find a way inside. And when they did not just steal gold. They destroyed evidence. Imagine entering an ancient tomb today and finding a necklace lying exactly where it was placed 3,500 years ago. You could study its position. You could examine the surrounding material. You could determine how the body had been dressed. You could identify the objects intentionally placed nearby. Now imagine someone entering the same tomb thousands of years earlier, smashing the burial apart, taking the valuables, and leaving everything else scattered across the floor. The information is gone. This is why intact burials are so rare, and why discoveries such as Tutankhamun's tomb are so extraordinary. But not every important tomb contains a body. Sometimes the most revealing burial is defined by its absence. That is exactly what happened at Sutton Hoo. When archaeologists uncovered the enormous ship burial, they expected to find the remains of a powerful individual. Instead, they found an empty space. The ship had been buried beneath the earth. The wood had disappeared, but its impression remained. Inside were weapons, precious objects, silverware, jewelry, and the famous helmet. Everything pointed toward an individual of extraordinary status. Yet the body itself was missing. At first, this seems like a failure. But the absence became evidence. The soil was highly acidic. Human bones could disappear under such conditions. So the empty burial was not necessarily proof that nobody had been buried there. The missing body told researchers something about the environment. And this is one of the strange lessons archaeology teaches. Sometimes nothing is actually something. A missing skeleton can reveal soil chemistry. A broken object can reveal ancient violence. An empty tomb can reveal ritual. A discarded tool can reveal technology. And a single piece of pottery can reveal trade. The ancient world communicates through absence as much as presence. Now consider another extraordinary burial, this time in Bulgaria. The Varna necropolis is more than 6,000 years old. When archaeologists uncovered the graves, they found some of the earliest known examples of worked gold. The craftsmanship is astonishing. But the real shock was not simply the gold. It was the social world represented by it. One individual had been buried with an enormous quantity of precious metal. Thousands of years before the pyramids. Thousands of years before the great Egyptian dynasties. Thousands of years before the first writing systems became widespread. Someone already possessed enough wealth to separate himself dramatically from the rest of his community. This means that social hierarchy was not a late invention. Power and inequality were already shaping human societies deep in prehistory. And then, the mystery becomes even stranger. Some graves contained no bodies. Instead, archaeologists found symbolic objects, including human-shaped gold representations. Who were these graves meant to represent? People who died elsewhere? Important individuals whose bodies could not be recovered? Or something completely different? The evidence does not give us a final answer. But that uncertainty is exactly what makes archaeology so fascinating. The past is not a puzzle where every piece has a matching answer. Sometimes a piece survives without the picture, and we have to accept that. Now travel thousands of kilometers south. In Peru, another burial challenged assumptions about who could hold power. The Lady of Cao was buried with symbols of authority and weaponry. Her body was covered with intricate tattoos. She lived in the Moche world, a civilization famous for its monumental architecture, sophisticated ceramics, and powerful rulers. For decades, scholars had interpreted Moche society primarily through male authority. Then her tomb was discovered. Suddenly, the old model was no longer sufficient. Here was a woman who had been treated as an elite individual, perhaps a ruler, perhaps a religious leader, perhaps both. Her existence forced historians to reconsider the role of women in ancient political systems. And that is the hidden power of archaeology. A single grave can challenge an entire theory, not because the grave gives us every answer, but because it gives us evidence that cannot simply be ignored. The same thing happened with the Griffin warrior in Greece. A tiny seal, barely a few centimeters across, contained a scene of astonishing artistic sophistication. The warriors were rendered with extraordinary detail. The image was so precise that some features were less than a millimeter wide. And yet the object came from a Bronze Age burial. The discovery suggested that artistic techniques far more advanced than previously assumed were already being practiced. It also revealed connections between the Mycenaean world and the Minoan civilization of Crete. Cultures were not developing in isolation. They were watching each other, borrowing, adapting, competing, and exchanging knowledge. The same pattern appears in ancient Egypt. The royal family of Akhenaten and Nefertiti did not exist in a vacuum. Their world was connected to foreign powers through diplomacy and trade. Letters preserved from the Amarna period reveal communication between the Egyptian court and rulers across the ancient Near East. Kings discussed gifts, marriage alliances, military assistance, gold, status, political relationships. This means that the famous royal family was participating in a much larger international system. And when Akhenaten changed Egyptian religion, the consequences were not limited to theology. They affected the political structure of the kingdom. The location of the capital changed. Resources were redirected. Temples were transformed. The royal family became the center of an entirely new religious system. And then, after Akhenaten's death, the system began collapsing. The old gods returned. The traditional capital regained importance. The Amarna experiment was abandoned, and the names of Akhenaten and his successors were gradually removed from monuments. But history did not disappear completely. Fragments survived, and now the lost city of Aten is helping archaeologists recover them. The city is particularly valuable because it captures ordinary life during a period dominated by extraordinary royal events. The palace may tell us what the king wanted people to believe, but a worker's home can tell us what people actually did. A workshop can reveal what they produced. A storage room can reveal what they consumed. A broken tool can reveal how they worked. And a forgotten piece of pottery can reveal how the economy functioned. These details may seem insignificant compared with a golden mask, but they may be far more important, because kings come and go, cities rise and fall, religions change, but ordinary life leaves patterns, and patterns help reconstruct the past. Perhaps this is where the mystery of Nefertiti will eventually be solved, not through a spectacular discovery bearing her name, but through a small piece of evidence that places her in a specific moment. A seal, a burial, an inscription, a workshop record, a fragment of jewelry, something that tells us where she was when the political world around her began to collapse. Until then, Nefertiti remains suspended between history and legend. We know her face. We know her name. We know she was powerful. But we do not know exactly how her story ended. And that missing ending is what keeps the mystery alive. Because somewhere beneath the sands of Egypt, there may still be a chamber that has never seen modern light. A chamber where the air has been still since the Bronze Age. A chamber where the objects remain exactly where ancient hands placed them. Perhaps there is a royal burial. Perhaps there is nothing. Perhaps there is another forgotten person whose story will change our understanding of the entire period. That is the terrifying beauty of archaeology. You never know what is waiting beneath the next layer of sand. You only know that the earth has been keeping secrets for a very long time. And sometimes when that secret finally emerges, it does not simply tell us something about the dead. It tells us something uncomfortable about ourselves. We think civilization moves in a straight line, primitive, then advanced, ancient, then modern. But the tombs tell a different story. Human beings were always complicated. They created beauty and violence, faith and fear, technology and superstition, power and inequality. They loved, they fought, they mourned. They built monuments because they feared being forgotten. And perhaps that is the greatest secret buried inside every tomb. The people who placed those objects beside their dead believed they were preparing for eternity. They could not have imagined that thousands of years later, strangers would stand above their graves and try to understand them. Yet here we are, still searching, still asking, still opening doors that have been closed since the ancient world. And somewhere in Egypt, the silence surrounding Nefertiti and Tutankhamun may still be hiding one final piece. A piece that could turn an ancient mystery into a historical fact. Until that day comes, the desert keeps its silence. And the tombs keep waiting. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of everything we have uncovered. After thousands of years, the ancient Egyptians still have a way of making us realize how little we truly know. A city can disappear beneath the sand. A tomb can vanish beneath a palace. A royal name can be erased from stone. And yet somehow, a single object, a hidden chamber, or a forgotten burial can survive long enough to whisper the truth back to us. The story of Nefertiti, Tutankhamun, and the lost city of Amarna is not simply the story of a famous queen and a boy king. It is the story of a family caught inside one of the most extraordinary transformations in ancient Egyptian history. More than 3,000 years ago, Egypt was ruled by a royal family that attempted something almost unimaginable. They abandoned ancient traditions, rejected powerful gods, moved their capital into the desert, and built an entirely new city dedicated to the sun disk Aten. That city was Akhenaten. Today, it is better known as Amarna. For a short and dramatic period, it became the center of the Egyptian world. Palaces rose from the desert. Temples opened toward the sky. Workshops filled with craftsmen. Administrators recorded the movement of food, animals, tools, and luxury goods. Ordinary families lived beside the royal court, while priests and officials struggled to adapt to a religious revolution that had overturned centuries of tradition. And at the center of it all stood Akhenaten and Nefertiti. But their world did not survive. When Akhenaten died, the experiment began to collapse. The old gods returned. The royal court abandoned Amarna. The monuments were dismantled. The names of Akhenaten and even some members of his family were deliberately removed from later history. Then came Tutankhamun. The boy who would become one of the most famous pharaohs in history inherited a kingdom still recovering from the chaos created by his father. His original name was Tutankhaten, meaning the living image of Aten. Then something changed. His name became Tutankhamun. The god Aten was replaced by Amun. The capital moved back toward the traditional centers of Egyptian power. The old religion returned, and Amarna was left behind. For centuries, the city slowly disappeared beneath the desert. But the story did not end there. In modern times, archaeologists began uncovering the remains of this forgotten world. Streets emerged from the sand. Houses revealed ordinary objects. Workshops showed how craftsmen lived and worked. Storage rooms contained evidence of food production and administration. And then came one of the most important discoveries. A vast settlement outside the royal center began to reveal itself. This was not a monumental temple. It was not another palace. It was a city where people actually lived. The discovery became known as the Lost Golden City, although its ancient name was likely connected with the city of Aten itself. Its streets, walls, houses, workshops, and everyday objects offered something that royal tombs rarely provide: human life. The archaeology revealed bakeries, kitchens, administrative areas, storage spaces, tools, jewelry, molds, pottery, and countless fragments of ordinary existence. And that is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Because history is usually written through kings, but cities remember everyone. They remember the workers who shaped the walls, the women who prepared food, the craftsmen who produced jewelry, the scribes who recorded supplies, the servants who maintained the royal household, and the people who lived through the terrifying transformation of Egypt's religion. The Lost City gives us a glimpse into the world that existed around the royal family. A world that may have known Nefertiti. A world that almost certainly knew Tutankhamun's family. A world that existed before the young king's tomb became one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time. And yet, despite everything we have found, one question continues to haunt Egyptologists. Where is Nefertiti? Her disappearance remains one of ancient Egypt's most persistent mysteries. She was one of the most powerful women of the Amarna period. Her images appear beside Akhenaten in ways that demonstrate extraordinary royal authority. She participated in religious ceremonies. She was represented in monumental art. She was clearly more than a ceremonial wife. And then, somewhere in the chaos surrounding the final years of Amarna, she disappears from the historical record. No universally accepted tomb. No securely identified mummy. No final resting place that everyone agrees belongs to her. For a woman who once stood at the center of Egyptian power, her disappearance is almost impossible to explain. And this is where Tutankhamun's tomb enters the story again. When Howard Carter discovered the tomb in 1922, he expected something extraordinary. What he found exceeded almost every expectation. Gold, furniture, weapons, chariots, statues, jewelry, funerary equipment, and the famous golden mask that would become an icon of ancient Egypt. But the tomb itself was strangely small for a pharaoh. That fact has inspired decades of debate. Was it built specifically for Tutankhamun? Was it originally intended for someone else? Could it have been connected to an earlier royal burial? And could some of the objects inside have originally belonged to other members of the Amarna royal family? Several objects appear to have been altered or repurposed. Some bear names associated with other royal figures. That does not automatically mean the tomb was Nefertiti's, but it does reveal something important. The burial of Tutankhamun was not an isolated event. It belonged to a complicated period when Egypt was trying to erase the Amarna revolution while simultaneously burying the people who had created it. And somewhere beneath that political transformation, the remains of a royal woman may still be waiting. For years, researchers have wondered whether unexplored spaces exist beyond the known chambers of Tutankhamun's tomb. Radar surveys produced intriguing results. Some interpretations suggested hidden spaces. Others argued that the apparent signals could be caused by natural formations or architectural features. The debate remains unresolved. And that is precisely why the mystery continues to capture the imagination. Because somewhere beneath the Valley of the Kings, there may be another royal story waiting to be read. Or there may be nothing at all. Archaeology is frustrating that way. It does not give us the answers we want. It gives us evidence. Sometimes that evidence points toward an extraordinary possibility. Sometimes it destroys a beautiful theory. And sometimes it simply leaves us standing in front of a sealed door. But the discoveries surrounding Amarna have already changed something fundamental. They have shown that ancient Egypt was not a frozen civilization. It was a society capable of radical change. Kings could challenge gods. Capitals could be abandoned. Entire communities could be relocated. Names could be erased. And within only a few generations, an entire political and religious experiment could almost disappear. Yet the physical remains refused to cooperate with the people who wanted history forgotten. The city survived. The workshops survived. The objects survived. The tombs survived. And eventually, the archaeologists arrived. That may be the greatest lesson hidden beneath the sands. A civilization can try to control its own memory. It can destroy statues, erase names, dismantle temples, reuse stones, seal tombs. But complete control over the past is impossible. Because somewhere, something always survives. A fragment of painted plaster, a forgotten seal, a damaged statue, a piece of jewelry, a burial chamber hidden beneath the floor, a worker's tool abandoned in a house, a child's footprint preserved in ancient mud. These tiny things can survive when empires cannot, and they allow us to reconstruct a world that its own rulers thought they had buried forever. Perhaps that is why the Lost City is so important. It does not simply tell us more about Nefertiti or Tutankhamun. It gives us the world around them. It shows us that behind the famous golden mask was a living society filled with people whose names history never preserved. It reminds us that the ancient world was not built by pharaohs alone. Thousands upon thousands of ordinary people made the temples, shaped the statues, prepared the food, carried the stones, raised the children, buried their dead, and kept the machinery of civilization moving. And when their city was abandoned, they left behind something more valuable than gold. Evidence. Evidence that could wait for 3,000 years. Today, we look at the ruins of Amarna and imagine silence. But once, these streets were filled with voices. The sound of workers, the movement of animals, the smell of bread baking, the ringing of tools against stone, the footsteps of officials, the ceremonies of priests, the arguments of ordinary people. And somewhere among those voices was the royal family, whose story would eventually become one of Egypt's greatest mysteries. Nefertiti, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun. Three names surrounded by unanswered questions. One queen whose final resting place remains uncertain. One king whose radical religious revolution transformed Egypt. And one boy who inherited the consequences of that revolution and became immortal after death. Their world disappeared, but it did not vanish completely. The desert remembered. The tombs remembered. The buried city remembered. And now, thousands of years later, we are listening. Perhaps archaeologists will one day uncover the chamber that finally identifies Nefertiti. Perhaps a hidden inscription will reveal what happened during the final days of Amarna. Perhaps another royal tomb lies untouched beneath the Valley of the Kings. Or perhaps the greatest secret is not hidden inside a tomb at all. Perhaps it has been lying openly beneath the Egyptian sun for centuries. The lost city itself, a forgotten civilization frozen at the exact moment when Egypt changed forever. That is what makes these discoveries so powerful. They do not simply answer questions about the dead. They force the living to question everything they thought they understood. The sands of Egypt have already given us kings, queens, mummies, temples, lost cities, and treasures beyond imagination. But the deepest mysteries remain underground, behind sealed doors, beneath forgotten floors, inside chambers that no human has entered for thousands of years. And somewhere in that darkness, another story may still be waiting. A story about Nefertiti, a story about Tutankhamun, a story about the lost city that witnessed their world. And perhaps one day, a discovery will finally connect all three. Until then, the ancient Egyptians keep their silence. And somehow that silence feels louder than any answer. And perhaps the final secret is not hidden inside a golden coffin, beneath a pyramid, or behind a sealed stone door. Perhaps it is hidden in the simple fact that after thousands of years, we are still searching. We began this journey looking for a lost city and a secret connected to Nefertiti and Tutankhamun. But the deeper we went, the more complicated the story became. We discovered that ancient Egypt was not simply a civilization of pyramids and mummies. It was a world of political struggles, religious revolutions, royal ambitions, forgotten workers, mysterious deaths, and carefully controlled memories. And at the center of this story stands one extraordinary question. What really happened to the royal family of Amarna? To understand why this question matters, we have to return to the moment when Akhenaten changed Egypt forever. Before him, Egypt's religious world was dominated by a vast collection of gods and temples. Amun, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Ra, and countless other deities were woven into every part of society. Priests controlled enormous temple estates. Religious rituals supported the authority of the pharaoh. The relationship between the king, the gods, and the people was deeply established. Then Akhenaten arrived. Instead of simply adding another god to the Egyptian pantheon, he elevated Aten, the visible disk of the sun, above the traditional gods. And he did something even more radical. He moved the capital. A new city was created in a previously undeveloped landscape. Akhetaten, the horizon of Aten. Imagine the scale of that decision. Thousands of people had to move. Buildings had to rise from bare ground. Palaces had to be constructed. Temples had to be built. Food had to be transported. Workshops had to operate. Officials had to organize everything. And all of it happened because one royal family wanted to create a completely new religious world. For a brief moment, it worked. But after Akhenaten's death, the system began to collapse. The city was abandoned. The temples of the old gods reopened. The names of Akhenaten and his successors were attacked. Statues were dismantled. Monuments were reused. The memory of the Amarna period was pushed into darkness. And then Tutankhamun appeared. The young king became the bridge between two Egypts. One represented the radical new religion of his father. The other represented the ancient traditions that had existed for centuries. His original name connected him with Aten. His later name connected him with Amun. That transformation was more than a change of letters. It was a political statement. Egypt was turning backward toward its ancient religious order, and the boy king was placed at the center of that restoration. But Tutankhamun died incredibly young. His reign lasted only around a decade. He left behind no great empire, no enormous military conquest, no massive pyramid. And yet more than 3,000 years later, almost everyone knows his name. Why? Because his tomb survived. That single fact changed modern archaeology forever. When Howard Carter entered the tomb in 1922, the world suddenly saw an extraordinary collection of objects that had escaped ancient looters. But Tutankhamun's tomb also raised a strange possibility. If this small tomb contained such unimaginable wealth, what might still be hidden inside the larger royal burial landscape? What happened to the tombs of other members of the Amarna family? Where was Nefertiti? Where were other royal relatives? And could some of their possessions have been reused inside Tutankhamun's burial? These questions remain alive because ancient Egypt was a civilization that constantly reused its own past. A royal object could be created for one person and later placed in another person's tomb. A statue could be altered. An inscription could be rewritten. A burial chamber could be expanded or adapted. An object that appears to tell one story might actually belong to another. That makes the archaeological detective work incredibly difficult. And it makes every new discovery potentially important. The lost city of Amarna has given researchers something that royal tombs alone cannot provide: context. Inside the city, Archaeologists can see how people actually lived. They can examine buildings, tools, food remains, production areas, administrative records, personal objects, and human remains. Together, these pieces reveal a society struggling to survive inside a revolutionary experiment. The city was not merely a royal residence, it was a living organism. And then, suddenly, it stopped. People left. Buildings were abandoned. Objects remained where they had been used. The desert slowly took everything back. That abandonment is one of the most powerful clues in the entire story. Because when a city is destroyed by war, archaeologists often find evidence of violence. But Amarna tells a different story. It appears to have been abandoned after the political and religious system supporting it collapsed. The city became unnecessary. And once the royal family moved away, thousands of ordinary people had little reason to remain. Imagine waking up one morning in a city built to represent the future, knowing that the future had already ended. The temples that once celebrated Aten became symbols of a rejected religion. The royal palace became a monument to a vanished family. The streets slowly emptied, and the desert began to erase the evidence. But history has a strange habit. The more aggressively a civilization tries to erase something, the more fascinating the missing pieces become. Akhenaten's name was attacked. Nefertiti disappeared. Tutankhamun became a footnote for centuries. Amarna became ruins. And then modern archaeology brought them all back. Perhaps that is why Nefertiti remains such a powerful figure. We know she existed. We know she was important. We know what she looked like from famous sculptures. We know she stood beside Akhenaten during one of Egypt's greatest religious transformations. But we do not know exactly how her story ended. That gap is enormous. And gaps in history have a strange power. They invite theories. They inspire expeditions. They make researchers search beneath floors and behind walls. They turn ordinary fragments into potential clues. But there is a danger. When evidence is incomplete, imagination can easily become stronger than archaeology. A hidden chamber does not automatically belong to Nefertiti. An unusual object does not automatically prove a secret conspiracy. A mysterious burial does not automatically rewrite history. The real story is often more complicated, and sometimes less spectacular. But that does not make it less extraordinary, because the genuine discoveries are already astonishing. A lost city buried beneath the desert. A royal family that attempted to transform Egyptian religion. A boy king whose tomb survived almost untouched. Mummies that still preserve traces of ancient lives. Objects that crossed enormous distances. Workers whose fingerprints remain in the archaeological record. These things do not need fantasy. The truth is already incredible. And perhaps the most important discovery is still happening now. Modern technology allows researchers to examine ancient sites without immediately destroying them. Ground-penetrating radar can identify hidden structures. Digital mapping can reveal the shape of buried settlements. Advanced imaging can examine mummies without opening them. Chemical analysis can identify materials that ancient people imported from distant lands. DNA research can sometimes reconstruct relationships between individuals separated by thousands of years. Every new technology gives archaeology another way to listen to the past. And somewhere beneath Egypt, there are still countless places that have never been opened. Some tombs remain undiscovered. Some settlements remain buried. Some inscriptions remain unread. Some royal bodies remain unidentified. Perhaps one of them contains the final piece of the Amarna puzzle. Maybe Nefertiti's tomb is still waiting. Maybe another member of the royal family lies nearby. Maybe the answer is hidden in a completely ordinary burial that nobody has yet connected to the royal household. Or maybe Nefertiti's final resting place has already been found, but we simply do not recognize it. That possibility is almost more haunting, because archaeology is not only about finding things, it is about understanding them. A treasure can be discovered in seconds. Understanding what it means can take decades. A mummy can be uncovered from the sand. Understanding who that person was can take generations. A city can be mapped. Understanding why its people left can remain difficult. And that is why the story of Nefertiti and Tutankhamun continues. Not because we know everything, but because we don't. The unanswered questions are what keep the ancient world alive. So when you look at the golden mask of Tutankhamun, remember that behind that famous face was a real human being. A young man, a king, a member of a complicated family. A ruler who inherited a broken religious system and tried to restore Egypt's ancient traditions. And when you look at the famous face of Nefertiti, remember that behind the beautiful sculpture was a woman whose final chapter remains hidden. She lived through one of the most dramatic periods in Egyptian history. She watched a new city rise. She stood beside a revolutionary king. She helped shape the image of a new religion. And then, she disappeared. The desert kept her secret, at least for now. Perhaps that is the final lesson of these ancient tombs. The dead do not speak, but they leave evidence. And sometimes that evidence survives longer than kingdoms, religions, languages, and even memory itself. A tiny seal can survive. A piece of jewelry can survive. A painted wall can survive. A fragment of bone can survive. A forgotten street can survive beneath the sand. And after thousands of years, someone comes along and asks the question again. Who were they? How did they live? Why did they disappear? And what were they trying to tell us? Maybe the lost city of Amarna has already answered part of that question. It tells us that history is not a straight line. It is a maze. Kings rise. Kings fall. Cities are built. Cities are abandoned. Names are celebrated. Names are erased. Tombs are sealed. And eventually, someone breaks the seal. We entered this story searching for a secret about Nefertiti and Tutankhamun. We found something even more profound. We found evidence of a civilization that tried to control its own destiny, failed, and still managed to leave behind enough clues for strangers thousands of years later to reconstruct fragments of its lost world. And perhaps one day, beneath the sands of Egypt, another archaeologist will uncover a doorway. Behind it may be a chamber untouched since the Amarna period. Inside may be a name, a royal name, a name that has been missing for more than 3,000 years. If that happens, everything we think we know about Nefertiti, Tutankhamun, and the final days of Amarna could change in a single moment. Until then, the mystery remains. The city is silent. The tombs are silent. The mummies are silent. But the evidence is still speaking. And somewhere beneath the ancient sands, the final chapter may already be waiting for someone brave enough to open the door.